Tonight, again, our topic is The King is Born, Life and Impacts of Emperor Haile Selassie First. And this conversation is to celebrate the 134th birthday of His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie. So I'll hereby invite our panel members. Currently, we have Dr. Oppong-Wadie and Dr. Sadia. We invite Dr. Oppong-Wadie to start and give us a historic account of the birth of Emperor Haile Selassie and his rise to the throne. So, my Lord, Dr. Oppong-Wadie, please give us your take on the subject. Thank you.
Well, give thanks, Ras Kofi Asante. I just want to humbly say that we have a empress, a sister here. So, ladies first. So, if she can begin, I can come in afterwards. Give thanks.
Rastafari, give thanks.
Oh, that's real. Okay, I was ready to come after you, but let me try my best and come before, since, ladies first. What do I say? Let's begin. When it comes to the topic of His Imperial Majesty, it's a very, very it's a very, very deep and passionate topic. And, I will not do justice to not begin this by acknowledging Ras Wiro's impact on my life as a Rastafarian. When I encountered Ras Wiro, I was 17 years old, in the prime of my coming up. Education from Ras Wiro and the then small Rastafari group is what impacted me to grow in my Pan-Africanism and Rastafari. So Ras Wiro, big ups to you for all the teachings. We read a lot of books. We did a lot of studies, a lot of discussions. We did a lot of activities, and then we met at the University of Ghana, Legon, and continued, and it's been going on and on till today. So I want to always pick you up for that. I learned a lot. The birth of His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie, the first King of Kings, Lord of Lords, conquering lion of the tribe of Judah, elect of himself, and earth rightful ruler, was a great African statesman. He was born in Ethiopia as Lich Tafari in 1930. Am I right?
1890.
What was the year?
1892.
1892.
Crowned in 1930.
All right. Thank you, Sister. Sometimes my mind becomes fragmented. He was born Lich Tafari Makonnen, July 23rd, 1892. He reigned and exited in 1975. He was the last reigning emperor of Ethiopia. He reigned from 1930 to 1974. He remains one of the most influential African leaders of the 20th centuries. His leadership transcended Ethiopia, shaping international diplomacy, African liberation, Pan-Africanism, human rights, and Black consciousness across the world. Yeah, so if we want to break it down, how His Imperial Majesty, the impact of His Imperial Majesty as tonight's topic depicts, we will see that he was a great statesman and he influenced in the topic areas that I have highlighted, which let's begin with African liberation. So why talk about African liberation? We've seen that there is something called white supremacy. And with this concept of white supremacy, Europeans or people with white skin, for lack of better words, European descent people who have the skin called white skin, versus us who from the African continent have dark skin, sun-kissed skin, come from being born under Ethiopia, under the light or the sunlight. Our skin are dark skin. And the Caucasians or the Europeans, having trapped in the Caucasus Mountain of Russia, around Russia, in the Ice Age, I believe, were trapped, and they lost civilization, were a primitive culture, and while Africa was booming in civilization. So when they came out of the mountains and encountered us Africans, I would say, maybe due to jealousy, our advancement, they saw our civilizations and everything we had built, especially the pyramids in Egypt, among other things. Actually, what I studied was that when they encountered us in Egypt, they saw us as gods and they bowed down to worship us. And they told us, teach us, great gods. And they began to learn under our feet and under the scholars of Egypt, who built great civilizations and pyramids. And then they began with a diabolical plan to steal and to conquer us so that they can inherit our civilization, then destroy us. This was the marking and the beginning of the destruction of Africa. And maybe when Dr. Wiro comes on, can clarify or can make some additions to what I'm saying, whereby maybe there were other civilizations built before Egypt and our encounter with Europeans, but the underlying factor was that they came with an agenda, and the agenda was to kill, steal, and destroy the Black race through a system called white supremacy, and to conquer us. They came to conquer us. So we saw the birth of that was slavery, segregation, apartheid, colonialism, a lot of isms and schisms that, I cannot even begin to mention, but to summarize these few: colonialism or slavery, colonialism, apartheid, and segregation, Jim Crow, and all kinds of rules that were meted against us. And I have Kwesi Pratt's reparations, history, struggle, politics, and law, where he was writing about our first encounter with the Europeans, where they sat at a Nicaea conference, and they decided to conquer Africa. And their decision to conquer Africa, they carved or partitioned territories for each European country, such as Britain would take a certain territory, Portugal, France, Belgium, whatever. All of these European countries decided that they will partition out, and this portion belonged to Africa. This portion belonged to this European country, this and that. So that is, to connect my thoughts, I'm saying it began from Egypt, where they came, they conquered us, and then we started to migrate all the way and found ourselves in places called Ghana, Nigeria, and other places, Togo, Benin. We were over there living as one continent again. We were one people. And then due to the Berlin Conference, I guess, right? The Berlin Conference, they partitioned, and then they moved further, came down, came to where we are now as Ghana, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, and all these places that were one family. And then they carved it all and put their marks on. So if you see some places like Burkina Faso and Ghana, I'm a Moshi person, which is Moshi is a nation. So the Moshi people, you find us in Burkina Faso, You find us in Wa, Upper West region. You find us in Kurusi, Kasina Nankani, the Paga area. You find us all to the way to Gambaga. So I met a guy in Houston, Texas, and I discovered he was a Moshi man from Burkina Faso. And I told him I was a Moshi man from Moshi from Ghana. And they told me that, oh, their grandfather's house is in Gambaga, which is northern part of Ghana, around Wale Wale. So my point is that is one family. But due to the partitioning of Africa, France now Faso and Britain now owns Ghana. And one family has become fragmented and divided. And so is a divide and rule and conquer. So my point, right, is saying that these Europeans came, they have divided us to rule us, enslave us, apartheid us, and all these divisions in America, segregation and all of that. So what is the importance now of His Imperial Majesty? The Imperial Majesty, His Imperial Majesty now is the symbol of liberation of the African race, because in the 20th century, it is believed that he was the most significant African statesman in the whole world that influenced and championed for the liberation of Africa. And I will pause there, and Ras Wiro can add his voice, and then we can expand the argument. So I'm coming from the point of colonial rule, white supremacy of Africans, and His Imperial Majesty impact onto the world now is through Pan-Africanism and liberation of the African race. So that's my take, and I will yield for Ras Wiro and then continue later. Give thanks.
Give thanks, Empress, for that powerful one. Yes, like you said, Europeans divided us, and Emperor Haile Selassie united us, representing the symbol of African liberation. We thank you so much. Please, if Prof. Wiro is ready, we'd like to have his take. Give thanks.
Give thanks, Ras Kofi Asante, and also I want to say give thanks to Sister Sadia. You take it as all the way back. Big up to you as well. It's been, believe it or not, it's been more than, I would say, 35 years, right? Yeah, since we first met. So it's always a pleasure. I want to quickly say that I'm at a conference right now. So I'm going to be in, but I'm also going to have to leave briefly and then join in again when I'm on the road. So please bear with me. I had to, ease out of the conference to come and join the Zoom. But give thanks for all the organizers of this event. It's always a joy. It's a joy celebrating His Imperial Majesty's 134th Earthstrong, which was on Thursday, but it's every day still. We just elevate that day and celebrate it. But we give thanks for this reasoning here in commemoration of the Earthstrong of His Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie I. I want to say that just as a little bit of historical background, Emperor Haile Selassie was born in a place known as Ejasagoro, which is in the province of Harar, which is in Ethiopia, in 1892, as has already been mentioned. He was born to Ras Makonnen, and his mother, why am I blanking off his mother's name right now? But it will come back to me. His mother, who was a Gurage from Ethiopia.
Elishabeth.
Say it again.
Elishabeth.
Yes, thank you, Empress Cheryl. Yes, Elizabeth. So we give thanks for that. Now, through this union, Emperor Haile Selassie brought forward after his mother had 8 miscarriages, and he was the 9th to be born to the couple, the only one who survived. Unfortunately, his mother passed in childbirth, and so he was primarily raised by his father. I want to say that contextualizing, I'm putting this in context because it is very important. Ras Makonnen, the father of Haile Selassie, and it is what I'm about to say is very important, particularly for parents and everyone who is raising young people. Ras Makonnen raised His Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie I. Ras Makonnen was what we'll call today, in American terms, we will say the Secretary of State, or in Ghanaian terms, we will say the Foreign Minister of Ethiopia under Emperor Menelik I. Now, so I'm saying all this to say that Ras Makonnen groomed His Majesty so well to, in the future, take his place in Ethiopia as the foreign minister. But as we will see, he even went beyond that. At a very early age, at the age of 13, His Majesty was given the title of the Jazz Match. The Jazz Match in English terms would mean something like a head of a certain area, a smaller area, right? So he was the Jazz Match, and then after the Jazz Match, he became a Ras. Now, as the Jazz Match, he was a teenager, Rastafari, when he showed such great promise in the affairs of foreign relations. As you are aware, his father, Ras Makonnen, had also made sure that he was learning the language of the international currency, that is French and English. He was very well versed in French. So as a teenager, he actually welcomed a delegation from Germany to Ethiopia. In other words, he had been so well groomed that as a teenager, he was acting as a foreign minister in the absence of his father, Ras Makonnen. He received this delegation so well that the delegation actually trumpeted how well composed he was and how well he received them and the royal dignity with which he received that delegation. Now, after his teenage years, he became the leader or the head of a province known as Sidamo, which is also in Ethiopia. When he became the head of that province, he realized that the province had been devastated economically, and therefore he came up with a plan to make amends to that level of economic devastation and divided the province into 12 different areas, with each area having a head, and the head initiating their own economic programs and reporting back to him. And that changed the fortunes of the province of Sidamo. Now, after serving Sidamo, he also became the head or ruler of Hara, which is a bigger province. And this was when he was elevated to Ras. Now, after serving in Hara, Emperor Menelik passed on, and Menelik passed on without a son. So he had a daughter who is Empress Zauditu, and her husband, who were appointed to succeed Menelik. But in contention also for the throne was a cousin of His Majesty known as Lej Yasu. Lej Yasu had also set his eyes on the throne and, claim descent, as is often done in Ethiopia, from the lineage of the King Solomon and Queen of Sheba, and had set his eyes on the throne. In fact, Lej Yasu briefly became ruler of Ethiopia, but when he was a teenager, a lot of people knew him for being a little bit of a party kind of guy, and that he brought that with him into the rulership, and therefore his reign did not last long. There were other things that went into it as well, which I'm not gonna necessarily dwell on right now. But after Empress Zauditu took the throne, Rastafari became a regent with Empress Zauditu. This is very important because what was happening is that, Rastafari brought his immense knowledge of international affairs to Ethiopia and to the rulership. Since Empress Zauditu had never traveled abroad, she had, really been in Ethiopia. And so when she assumed the throne, knowing that Rastafari, had this immense international knowledge, having bequeathed to him by his father, Ras Makonnen, and the travels that he had done and the interactions that he had had, made him the one in charge for all foreign relations. This is very important because I plan to dwell a little bit on the international impact of His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie I, particularly in relation to Black people worldwide. So His Majesty comes, and then he immediately sends a delegation to the United States. This was in 1919. The delegation was made up of the head of the Imperial Army of Ethiopia, the mayor of Addis Ababa, the mayor of Gondar province in Ethiopia, and also their secretary. Now, this delegation arrived in the United States under the presidency of President Woodrow Wilson, who is very much known in history as an unabashed racist. But at the same time, this delegation arrived here during that time. And this climate of racism also would impact the delegation. However, the delegation also had several successes. The delegation went to Washington, D.C., and then also to Chicago, not far from here, where I am right now. So the delegation came to Chicago. They were here for one particular reason in the United States. That is to renew the Treaty of Friendship that Emperor Menelik had signed with President Theodore Roosevelt of the United States between Ethiopia and the United States, which had expired in 1917. And His Majesty sent the delegation here to renew that treaty. When the delegation came, they visited places of, touristic interest. They were introduced to these places by the government, but they also visited the Black community. And they were asked several questions by the Black community here in Chicago. And, one particular question was, what should the Black community be doing in their fight for equal rights and justice? And the Ethiopian delegation told them to never give up and keep fighting for their liberation in the United States, and that the Ethiopians were also going to give them their very full support until this liberation is realized. So that was one of the very first feats chalked by His Majesty as regent under Empress Zauditu. Now, this delegation, after leaving Chicago, went back to Washington, D.C. But as you know, in those days, the Democratic Party of today in the United States was the party of the racists, and the Republican was more of the ones who pretended to be more inclusive, even though they were not. So the delegation came, and they were supposed to return to Washington, D.C. When they got to the Democratic headquarters, which they thought is where they were going to be hosted, they were quickly told that it is not allowed for the Democratic Party to host them, since they were Black people. So they hurriedly organized a hotel for their final dinner in the United States to take place. But even before that, they also went to the Republican side and to see if the Republican Party could host them. And the Republican Party then gave them the same response. So they had to then move the event to a hotel. And so the dinner even did not start till around 9 p.m. When they were able to begin the dinner, which lasted way into the night. And that was their final event here before leaving back to Ethiopia. Now, all this is very significant in terms of the international impact. Now, what was also going on at this time was that Marcus Garvey had left Jamaica and come to the United States and established the United Negro Improvement Association beginning somewhere around 1916. And His Majesty Haile Selassie and Marcus Garvey had been communicating. In fact, I'll get to that in a minute. So in the late 1910s and early 1920s, this synergy between Ethiopia and United States, particularly the UNIA, that's what I mean, was a synergy that was tight and growing. His Majesty then becomes Negus in 1928, which translated into English as king. And then in 1930, together with Empress Menen, crowned as the Emperor and Empress of Ethiopia. And I just want to say that it is important to note that when His Majesty was crowned as Ras, his Empress Menen was crowned same way. When he was crowned as king, she was crowned as queen, and when he was crowned as emperor, she was crowned as empress. So this is the equation that has been going on. Now, in 1922, His Majesty sent a Persian consulate, because back then, Ethiopia, in terms of its foreign arrangement, its foreign arrangements were carried out by the Persian consulate. So His Majesty sent the Persian consulate to the United Negro Improvement Association to make an offer of repatriation to members of the UNIA. This is also very important, as it will see some members of the UNIA leave the United States and head to Ethiopia, Lake Tana region to be specific. And it will also have implications for one of Ethiopia's greatest achievements today, which is the Ethiopian Airlines that we see. In fact, not far from where I am is the gentleman known as the Black Condor, Robinson, who was invited by His Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie I to come to Ethiopia and train Ethiopians on how to fly airplanes. He was a superb pilot, but because of discrimination, the American system would not allow him to fly the planes here in the United States. So that was an invitation that he honored. He went to Ethiopia. He fought with Ethiopia during the Ethiopian invasion. He trained people in Ethiopia to become pilots, and it was that training that provided the nucleus for the establishment of what we have now come to know as Africa's #1 airline, the Ethiopian Airlines. Now, in 1935, after His Majesty had been emperor for about 5 years, as we all know, the fascist Italian government under Benito Mussolini decided that they were going to make Ethiopia part of their territory, having initially annexed what we now know today as Eritrea and also Somalia as under Italian governance. Now, a few years earlier, it is important to note that this same Mussolini and his government had hosted His Majesty in Italy and were, dining with him and smiling with him and doing all this kind of stuff, not knowing that, they were planning to invade Ethiopia and also, in their minds, take revenge for their loss at the Battle of Adwa, which had occurred in 1896. So in 1935, Italy prepares to invade Ethiopia, which they did between 1935 and 1936. His Majesty briefly goes into exile, but one of the greatest impacts internationally was to come during this interwar period when His Majesty left Ethiopia and went through Jerusalem and went through Morocco and to Europe, where he made his plea before the League of Nations. And in this plea, he also gave a warning that what has happened to Ethiopia was going to happen to the European countries. In fact, he said the match that had been lit in Ethiopia was going to burn Europe. And that's exactly what happened in 1945 when the Second World War began. And this is because His Majesty had made a statement regarding what he called collective security. That simply means that if Ethiopia was a member of the League of Nations, then the League of Nations had to, as a matter of responsibility, protect Ethiopia when it was being attacked by Italy. However, what the League of Nations did was to pretend as if they were protecting Ethiopia, by the same time supplying ammunition to Italy and supporting the ban on ammunition getting to Ethiopia for the purposes of the war. So it was a two-faced situation. It was not until when Adolf Hitler was openly recognized by Benito Mussolini as allies that they sat up and said, oh, wait a minute, if that's the case, then we have to abandon course in sending ammunition to Italy and rather support Ethiopia. So this principle of collective security was advanced by His Majesty. And with this principle also comes something that His Imperial Majesty always talked about, which is international morality. International morality. So what is international morality? How are you exercising this international morality? And he always said international morality was at stake. In other words, if countries were not doing what they were supposed to do, then they were setting the precedent for anything to happen to any country, particularly the smaller ones. Excuse me 1 second. Now, His Majesty had been applying to come to the United States, but on 2 previous occasions, he had been told to wait. And I think that one of the reasons being the Second World War taking place. So after 1945, the date was set for His Majesty to arrive in the United States in 1954. But this also becomes very important because His Majesty had made a third request to the Black community in Ethiopia, in the United States, to come to Ethiopia. And this time, he said he was looking for professionals, teachers, mechanics, pilots, what have you, to come to Ethiopia. They were going to get the same salary that they would have received if they were in the United States. They were going to get housing. They were going to get 3 months vacation if they wanted to visit their relatives in the United States. And then after the 3 months paid vacation, they would come back and continue their work in Ethiopia. And that 3 months paid vacation was on a yearly basis. So if every year you work for 9 months and you wanted to take 3 months vacation to go and see your relatives in the United States or whatever, His Majesty will make sure that you are paid for and all that kind of stuff. Now, also consider the fact that at this particular point in time, there was something going on in the United States known as Jim Crow, which is similar to apartheid in South Africa, where the society was segregated. So the African-American community found this invitation very attractive, and that got to the American government that, these Blacks here are very interested and are preparing to go to Ethiopia. Some actually went. So the United States government, also not wanting the Black people to leave, also designed a strategy. So His Majesty, having accepted the invitation to come in 1954, 6 days before His Majesty's arrival in the United States, the government of the United States passed a landmark resolution known as the Brown versus Board of Education. Now, Brown versus Board of Education is the resolution that allowed Black people to integrate into the American system of schooling. In other words, before 1954, Black people had their own schools. They could not go to school with white people who also, were catered to by the government schools. So 6 days before His Majesty came, the government decided to pass this law that integrated the schooling system, Brown versus Board of Education. If you have heard of Ruby Bridges, she was the little girl who was the first, or one of the first, to be integrated. You see the picture where the FBI agents are marching her on a stairwell, and she was being hooted at by all these racists, and she went to the school, and within a few hours, every parent had withdrawn their children from the school. There were only like 5 or so families left. So 6 days before His Majesty came, in order to appease the Black community and turn their minds away from Ethiopia, the United States government decided to integrate American schooling under Brown versus Board of Education. However, His Majesty did come in 1954. He was again taken around Washington, D.C. He came here to Chicago. He met with, the press and also taught several places. But at one point in time, he told the government officials, I want to meet with the Black people. And they said, okay. So there's this high school not far from here known as Wendell Phillips High School. Within 2 hours, they were able to arrange for His Majesty to meet the Black people of Chicago at this high school. The high school, it was totally packed. Within 2 hours, the word was able to get around Chicago. People could not move. This is a legendary visit. The students there were able to, within 2 hours, learn the Ethiopian national anthem and perform it for His Majesty on this occasion. His Majesty also visited the Coptic Church here in Chicago, and also gave a speech at a park also not far from here known as Washington Park. And this is where he declared that for the second time, because he had already declared this in Ethiopia, that I am not only the king of Ethiopia, but I am the king of all Black people worldwide. This becomes important because a few years later, His Majesty is also going to send his cousin, Dr. Melaku Bayen, whose wife is also from the Chicago area. And in fact, Melaku Bayen also lived here with his wife when he came to the United States to establish the Ethiopian World Federation, which is a very progressive organization as we have known it from that time onto this time. Now, in terms of the international impact of His Majesty, in terms specifically in relation to Black people of the world, there was a Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago known as Eric Williams. And Eric Williams had visited His Majesty in Ethiopia. I believe this was in the early 1960s. I don't remember the date off my head, but during his visit to Ethiopia, he invited His Majesty to come to Trinidad and also, meet and interact with the Black people over there. So His Majesty accepted the invitation. It was this invitation that saw His Majesty visit Trinidad, Jamaica, and also Haiti. Now, as we all know, the welcome that His Majesty received in Jamaica was a phenomenal one that is for the history books and primarily championed by the Rastafari community in Jamaica at that time. So His Majesty's visit was also very instrumental because what the Jamaican government was hoping for at that time was His Majesty to come and denounce the Rastafari, and because they were perceiving Rastafari as a problem group of people because of the anti-colonial stance that Rastafari has. However, His Majesty, as we all know, did not do that. He came to Jamaica, met with the Rastafari leaders, and even gave them medals on that visit. So the impact of Rastafari grew worldwide, but we cannot also talk about the international impact without making reference to the formation of the Organization of African Unity, which is now known as the African Union, headquartered in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and having as its first chair His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie I the. So I think that in a nutshell, I'm going to take a pause here, but before I do that, let me quickly respond to something that Sister Sadia said. Once upon a time, well, let me put it this way. The mother and father of this earth is African people. There is no question about this. History has shown that, science has shown that, and I, the children, also say that. I'm saying that to say that once upon a time, it was us who taught the mathematics, taught the sciences, brought civilization to the world, taught the rudiments of agriculture to all savage peoples who knew nothing about using the stellar world as guidance for life on this earth. It was our forefathers and foremothers who introduced these to the world. So I'm supporting what you were saying. In fact, the conference that I'm at right now, there is a gentleman he's a Black, but he is domiciled to the United Kingdom. He is known as Robin Walker. He has a book, a very instrumental book, When the World Was Black. That's the title of the book, When the World Was Black, right? Making this same argument. So I give thanks for the time. I am going to hop off for a second, and then I'll join back when I'm in the car.
Give thanks so much, Prof. Wiro. Thank you so much. You've given us a lot
to think about on this special Rastafari reasoning that celebrates His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie. For most of us, you have caused us to know His Majesty more than we already know him. So we thank you so much. I trust we'll come back to you. Please, is Jahpila here? Yes, Jahpila from Kenya. If you are here, we'd like to have your take on the topic. Yes, Jahpila. If Jahpila is not here, Ras Lyrics, are you here?
I think Jahpila is ready to speak.
Yes, Jahpila, please.
Rastafari.
Haile Selassie first.
Yeah, man. Give much thanks. The King of Creation, Emperor Haile Selassie the First, and for the Earthstrong of His Majesty in this time, 2026. It shows that the victory for I and I is assured. Rastafari through struggle. Trotting up to this time, from generation to generation, and spreading across the continent and across the world with a message of peace and love and liberty. Unlike other religions and sects and other organizations which spread their roots through violence, corruption, and manipulation. So we honor and we are proud of Rastafari liberty and for the coming generations. Greetings from Kenya, Nairobi, Mombasa, and all other counties. Different brethren from different community passing same love and unity. Because we identify the Rastafari struggle, we are all over the world and all over different places in the continent. We actually share the same sentiments and the same struggle, same challenges that affect I and I Rastafari. And moreover, that we are called by the name of Rastafari, our King, our Lord and Savior. So in Kenya, Rastafari, His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie the First, is recalled even as the first head of state from Ethiopia to visit Kenya when Kenya got independence. The struggle for the independence of the Kenyan people was supported and funded by His Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie I from Ethiopia. These were the Mau Mau, including General Kemathi and General Baimungi, who are the main general that were leading the liberation struggle for the land. Haile Selassie played a very important part, which remind I and I in this generation that until when all Africans speak as a free being with one voice, then the freedom is not yet guaranteed. In Kenya, we continue to face the same challenges, just like other different countries in Africa, to ensure that Rastafari live free from blame and fear, and that the works of His Majesty are well established, which will help to mitigate and to approach the solutions that are needed in this time to help Africa move forward and to make us stand independent. The birth of His Majesty to the people signifies a renewal of our hearts, our spirit, towards our livication, for the progress of our continent and as a people. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government is upon his shoulder. Haile Selassie words are very significant up to this time. They are very relevant. And even through the pages of history and up to this time, the name of His Majesty keeps surfacing. You know, it can't be erased. So we still call upon the name of the Most High. We call upon the name of Africa. We call upon the name of unity, cooperation, and working together for the same achievement that we will be able to sustain and to realize in this time. Rastafari in Kenya is looking forward, especially to this in this year, to link up forward with I throughout in the continent and in the world, to address various issues, including I economic progress, centralization of trade, and also doing business among I, for His Majesty call upon balance in everything spiritual and material. I give thanks to all the panelists. Give thanks, I see Daddy Bosco there. Beloved, yeah man, enough love and greetings. We dare still upon the reasoning. I man Jahpila reaching out. Salute one and all. Blessed. Reasoning still going on.
Rastafari, give thanks, Jahpila, for your take on the topic. Do we have Ras Lyrics from Sierra Leone with us? Ambassador Lyrics. Well, it seems Lyrics couldn't join us. Ras Thau Thau also couldn't join us because of the timing. He presumed
Ras Thau Thau's here. Please,
wow.
Ras Thau Thau's here, yes.
Yeah.
Wow. General Thau Thau, give thanks. My Lord, please give us your
Greetings,
take.
Rastafari.
Haile Selassie, the king is born, the life and impact of Emperor Haile Selassie. So, General Thau Thau, please give us your take.
Give thanks. Is Ras Lyrics not available yet?
Yes, he's not available.
Okay, because I just came in now while Ras Jahpila was giving the historical relationship of His Majesty and Kenya. So I did not get the opportunity to hear from other ones. So am I supposed to speak on the same topic? The main topic?
Yes. Yes, the main topic, but I think a lot have gone into the history and His Majesty's relationship in African unity, fighting the Italian fascist invasion, and also His Majesty's impact with other countries and supporting other liberation movements. So if you can delve into the spiritual or religious significance of His Majesty in terms of his life and impact, his relevance or in the Rastafari movement, I think that is the part we have not delved into yet. So if you can delve into that part or the general topic, we'll be happy. Give thanks.
All right, no, give thanks. Ras Kofi Asante, Rastafari Council of Ghana Educational Program, honorable members on the platform, my honorable chairman, Daddy Bosco, what's up, Charlie? And I see Mama Ain is also there. Enough respect to the mother, the matriarch, and also to all honorable members in the platform here. It's indeed always a great moment to have this type of reasonings, because from we come up in Rastafari, we cite up Rastafari we were always taught that reasoning is a cornerstone in Rastafari, where we get to separate sense from nonsense and continue with our edification and enlightenment. So my reasoning is divided into two parts. The first part is the historicals, which is directly I personal history as to when did I first hear about His Majesty Haile Selassie and how I eventually became a Rasta. And then the second part of the conversation, of the reasoning, will be about what I call the Rastafari trilectic, or the three dimensions of Rastafari, in the context of the internationalization of Rastafari, when Rastafari left Jamaica and became an international movement. With the historicals, my grandfather was a soldier for the South African British Army. You know, what most people don't know is that South Africa was once USA before it became RSA. Before it became the Republic of South Africa, it used to be Union of South Africa. In 1910, in 1899 to 1902, the British and the Boers is this white who call themselves Afrikaners now, who oppressed us from 1947 with the system of apartheid. So in 1899 and 1902, they fought among themselves. It is referred to as the Anglo-Boer War. Now, with the ANC taking power in 1994, it started to rewrite history. As you know, that history is always written by the victors. In rewriting history, they refer to that period as the South African War. Otherwise, historically, it's known as the Anglo-Boer War. So in South Africa, there is a record of 8 conflicts. We had 8 conflicts. The 8 conflicts being the pre-colonial war, genocide, slavery, the pre-colonial conflict. Actually, they are all referred to as conflict. Is the pre-colonial war, genocide, slavery, wars of resistance, when the African tribesmen were fighting the British and the Boers' encroachment and colonization of South Africa. And then there was the Anglo-Boer War, which I say they now refer to it as the South African War. And then there was the First World War and the Second World War. And then the 8th one being Wars of Liberation from 1960 to 1994. So my grandfather took part in the Second World War. The British South African Army were the first to enter Addis Ababa in 1940. In 1941, when the British decided to help His Majesty retain his throne, as we all know that he was exiled in Britain. So in this conflict, the British Empire drafted all natives who were part of the British colonies, including South Africa. So he was one of the British Army, one of the British soldiers who entered Addis Ababa before His Majesty arrival, because His Majesty entered through the Sudan and then they entered through Kenya. So I grew up hearing him say, I fought for Haile Selassie. So in my family, this is my maternal grandfather. This is my mother's father, who passed on around 2001. Actually, not just my grandmother, his wife passed 2001, and he passed around 1998. So I grew up hearing him talking about fighting for His Majesty. So in our family, me and him, I always say me and him are the only 2 people who were His Majesty's soldiers. So he went to Ethiopia in 1941 and then he came back talking about Haile Selassie, Haile Selassie. That was really my first time hearing of Haile Selassie, even before coming into contact and consciousness of Rastafari. And then I became the second one in the family who went to Ethiopia in 2003, where I was given a scholarship by Abuna Paulos, His Holiness, the late head of the Ethiopian Church, the late Archbishop of the Ethiopian Church. So where I was studying at St. Paul High Theology College, what they call Kedus Paulos Suasua Berhan, in Addis Ababa in Kulfema Salamia. Just next door of it was the training center where Mandela was trained in 1962 when he went to Ethiopia to be trained as a soldier, as a commander of Umkhonto weSizwe, the Liberation Army of the ANC. So there at the school, these guards, whom the Ethiopians refer to them as the Zebenya, he used to always, when he see me, he will say, Dagmawi Mandela, or Mandela the Second. One day I asked him, why do you call me that? He said, no, you're the second South Africans who came to train here. Mandela was the first. So he came to train militarily, and you came to train theologically, because I was there on scholarship of the Ethiopian Church. So my first encounter with the name Haile Selassie was with my grandfather. He used to say that a lot, that we went to Ethiopia to fight for Haile Selassie. We went to Ethiopia. But then the second formal one was at school when I was doing standard 7. Today they call it grade 8. In the history books, they taught about Haile Selassie, the Italian-Ethiopian War, the formation of the OAU. So all of that in relation to His Majesty. And then, until then, I set up Rastafari in 1990, which is like 36 years ago. So that is basically my history with the person Haile Selassie, the name Haile Selassie, the King Haile Selassie, the Field Marshal Haile Selassie. As I first got introduction from a military man who was my grandfather, who know him militarily, but I have some very interesting things to say. Like most of elderly people I subsequently met when I was in Tanzania. I met an old man who said Haile Selassie when he visited during Julius Nyerere's time. He said there's 2 most powerful men he met in his life, and they were both short. They were both short, like short men, like, not tall. And then he will make mention of Haile Selassie and Mahatma Gandhi. That these are the 2 most mystical men he came across. So for all people, Rasta and non-Rasta, who encountered Haile Selassie, they have very interesting things to say about His Majesty. Mandela wrote in his book, Long Walk to Freedom, that when he shook the hands of Haile Selassie, it was like shaking hands with history. He said most colorful things about Haile Selassie that are contained in his book, Long Walk to Freedom. And then, being a Rasta, as I've already stated that I've been with the Rastafari movement for the past 36 years. Being a Rasta, one of the things in studying the movement and the dimensions of the movement, I realized that the movement is basically divided into 3 dimensions. There is a diaspora dimension, which then is made up of the Jamaican dimension, who basically made a movement out of his name and made a god out of him, and made a levity out of him, and basically a revolutionary movement and a religious movement. So with this diaspora dimension, the Jamaican dimension, in the very beginning of the movement, in 1932, we see four personalities: Leonard Percival Howell, Robert Hines, Archibald Dunkley, and Joseph Nathaniel Hibbert. These four men represented four different schools of thoughts in the very beginning of Rastafari. And most of their organs or houses or functions, they never made it into the history of Rastafari. Usually we are taught about Nyabingi, Bobo Shanti, and 12 Tribe, which are basically structures that transform Rastafari from a revolutionary movement to a religious movement, in a sense that all three of them, they were highly biblical and had a very biblical relationship with His Majesty. Although Archibald Dunkley's orientation was based on the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, Joseph Nathaniel Hibbert's orientation was based on the Masonic order, because he was part of the Masonic order at Costa Rica called the Egyptian Mystic Mason. And most of the pictures that we have of Joseph Nathaniel Hibbert is this picture of a man wearing a crown, wielding a sword, and wearing some Masonic symbols. And then Leonard Howell's structure was called the Ethiopian Salvation Society, which was more of giving communal life to Rastafari in a form of pinnacle, where he was more leading like an African chief in an African village. And then within that diaspora, we have to take in the North American contribution to the movement. There's still a large debate as to the first group of people to identify as the Rastafari were the North Americans. Many ones have written extensively about that. The Rastafariites, which Leonard Howell learned from them and took these to Jamaica. And then also there is some testimony coming from the Howellites, which came to us through Dr. Carol Yoni in 2000 when she came to South Africa in search of the Holy PB, the big PB. She was bringing the small PB that is in circulation right now, but there is a big PB, which was in Kimberley. In the 1920s, there was a church by the mine workers, the diamond diggers in Kimberley, South Africa. This church was referred to as the Hermetic Church, or the Church of the Children of Hem, also known as the Earthly Afro Construction Church, the AACC, the Catholic. So, which was then banned around 1927 by the Union of South Africa for advocating the idea of the Black God of Ethiopia. And then they were charged with sedition, and then they were banned. So the Howellites, from the documents that Carol Yoni carried, and even from one video I once see with Miss Catherine, is it Catherine Powell? This mama who always say, I'm a Rasta. You know, you can never take me out of Rasta. There is this mama who was taking care of Leonard Howell, where they talk about the seed of Rastafari came from this particular church that was in Kimberley. They said this is what Leonard Howell told them. You can get that in the book called Leonard Howell and the Millenarian Movement. So that's some of the diaspora dimension of Rastafari. And of course, you have the African dimension of Rastafari, which is largely influenced by reggae music, and which then majority of the African Rasta when they start to cite up Rastafari, they 10 Jamaicans. That is, they start to speak patois, they start to imitate everything Jamaicans do, even go to the extreme. In terms of the Nyabingi, Bobo Shanti, 12 tribe, they'll start to speak patois and all of that. And then you have the third dimension, which is the Ethiopian dimension, which I encountered that when I was studying in Ethiopia, that you find that most of the Ethiopian Rasta I'm talking about the indigenous Ethiopian Rasta now, the Ethiopian-born Rasta, not the Rastafari who repatriated to Shashamani, but those who were born, they call themselves the Habasha Rasta or the Habesha Rasta. I find that most of them, they regard His Majesty, or they look at His Majesty like Jesus Christ. I've never really truly came across an Ethiopian who says Haile Selassie is the Almighty. So the Ethiopian Orthodox Church upbringing that they were brought up with influenced their conception of Rastafari and Haile Selassie. While the African Rasta imitate largely what the Jamaican say. And then, of course, I've spoken about the diaspora, which include the Caribbean and North America. And then I'll even, when I say the Caribbean, I talk also not only of Jamaica, but also of Costa Rica. So these three dimensions feed into how Haile Selassie is perceived globally. So politically, there are those who have a very political view of him, the Mandelas, the Julius Nyerere, the Kwame Nkrumah, who were working together with His Majesty, even with the formation of the OAU. And then, of course, you have a social view, those who His Majesty visited their countries like Malawi, like Kenya, and other parts of Africa, have mixed views of His Majesty. And then you get to the Ethiopian one, which then also they're divided into two. You have the Ethiopian Rasta, who are having a Rastafari conception of Haile Selassie, albeit based on the Jesus Christ concept. But you also have Ethiopians who are not Rasta, who I've also encountered during my 2 years of stay and study in Ethiopia. I remember there was a lady who was always coming to the church, helping to teach me with gays and all of that. Her name is Banchi Amlak. Now, one day I had a conversation with Banchi Amlak's grandmother. And then she said she came from Wolo, where Empress Menen come from. And that they came to Addis Ababa as the bridegroom of Empress Menen. And then she said to me, Haile Selassie did not die. I asked her what happened. She said he went straight to the moon. She said, every time you see a full moon, what you see inside the moon is Haile Selassie. Well, I knew this idea to be a Rasta idea because my very first wife, who passed away in 2009 through car accident, may his soul continue to rise in power. She used to say when she see me wearing this image of His Majesty, of the coronation, wearing his crown, she will say, this person you carry around your neck look like what I see in the moon every time. So later, outside of Rastafari, while in Ethiopia, I met somebody who also corroborated the same thing. I met a deacon of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church who said to me, Haile Selassie is not a name of a person. He said it's not a name of a person, it's not the name of an angel. I asked him, what is Haile Selassie? What is it a name for? He said, Haile Selassie is the name of a god. you'll get those moments in Ethiopia where somebody will come and give a most powerful revelation for 1 minute or two and just don't say anything further. Just say, do you know that Haile Selassie is not the name of a person? It's not even the name of an angel. You say, what is the name for? It's the name of a God. And then the conversation ends there. And then when I first arrived, I went to Ethiopia through Kenya. That was my second trip to Kenya. And I stayed in Kenya for 7 days while I'm waiting for my visa. Then there was no buses from Nairobi to Ethiopia or Moyale. There was trucks because there was a group of bandits, Somali bandits known as the Shifters, who were harassing the buses and all of that. So there were no buses. So I took a truck to there. So when I arrived at Moyale, I crossed into Ethiopia. When you're coming from that direction, you pass through Shashamane before you go to Addis Ababa. So we stopped in at Addis Ababa. I stayed for about, we stopped at Shashamane, I stayed about four days. So usually the Rastas, then was Ras Muya, the late, was the first keeper of the tabernacle, the Nyabingi tabernacle, one of the builders, together with Bongo Solo. Both of them have since passed on. So he took me to Wondogenet, to the hot springs. It was during the Ethiopian holidays, and there were a whole lot of Ethiopians there. And there is a very large community of Pentecostal Ethiopian Christians. Otherwise, the Ethiopians refer to them as the Pentes. So they are, Pentecostal, the born-again Christians are the same everywhere in the world. When they see you, they see a soul that needs to be saved, and they start to preach their doctrine of Jesus to you. So they came to me to do the same thing. I told them that, look, this is a holiday resort. I'm not interested in discussing religion and God here. I came here just to relax. That man, when he was retreating, he said to me, do you know Jesus Christ was a Jew, and the Jews, they never accepted him? Haile Selassie and Ethiopians don't accept him. Then I said to him, then you have an answer to your question. Why we non-Ethiopians will have a different conception of Rastafari and Haile Selassie away from you as Ethiopians who claim to know him. So you will get all these type of encounters where people tell you that, Haile Selassie went to the moon. Haile Selassie is not a man, it's the name of a god. Haile Selassie, we Ethiopians, we don't accept him, just like the Jews never accepted him, but doesn't necessarily nullify Haile Selassie or nullify what Rastafari say. Now, we go back to the inception of Rastafari, that from inception, Rastafari was never a one-voice movement. It was a multiple-voice movement. As I mentioned, that in the beginning of Rastafari, we find four main characters, or four main patriarchs. Leonard Howell, Archibald Dunkley, Robert Hines, and Joseph Nathaniel Hibbert. These four men did not have a uniformed view of His Majesty. Leonard Howell said Rastafari is the Almighty, that is God. Archibald Dunkley said is Jesus, the returned Messiah. And Hibbert looked at him more or less like the divine kingship, like the pharaohs of Egypt. So there was always Egyptology in the roots of Rastafari. And there was always Christology in the roots of Rastafari. And there was an outright declaration of Rastafari as the Almighty in the form of Leonard Howell and Robert Hines. This then morphed and matured into functions of Rastafari as we know them today, where you have the Nyabingi order said His Majesty is the Almighty, and certain members of the Nyabingi who are still suffering from the Christian mindset that is functioning within Rastafari. They will say he's Christ in his kingly character, or the returned Messiah. And then, of course, you have the Bobo Shanti who say Haile Selassie is one of the 3 persons in the Trinity, that the 3 persons are Marcus Garvey, Haile Selassie, and Prince King Emmanuel. That King Emmanuel is the priest, Haile Selassie is the king, Marcus Garvey is the prophet, taken from the Israelite triune concept of divinity, priest, prophet, and king. So from that vintage up until now, which I haven't even, when I speak about Africa, I haven't even talked about the African indigenous movements of Rastafari, sovereign indigenous Rastafari who are looking at His Majesty from an African point of view, not Jamaican, not Ethiopian, but from an African point of view, that you will then have groups like Bakehase, which is what the group, the order it belongs to. You'll have groups like Bakalipi, you'll have groups like the Mau Mau Order of Nyabingi in South Africa, through the likes of Ras Ganjaman. Ras Jahpila will remember Ras Ganjaman. I came with him to Kenya in 2015. And then also, again, even in Kenya, you get the Mau Mau, through my brother Mau Mau, who passed on not long ago. And then you've got different groups. I mean, when I go to Tanzania, I meet the likes of Rasi Kabonga. They will be telling you that, no, you don't need to go further. Kilimanjaro is Mount Zion. And then you go to Kenya, you meet the likes of Ras Mau Mau, Ras Bumoki wa Naina, and others who will be telling you that Mount Kenya is Mount Zion. So you have arrived in Zion, you don't need to go further. So you have this tendency of domesticating Rastafari within every African country, different African countries. And of course, there are so many indigenous groups of Rastafari, whereby the African in the continent, they evolved their own sighting of His Majesty based on their own understanding, which is an understanding that tries to incorporate the indigenous spiritual view, the indigenous African spirituality, with the inherited Jamaican conception of Rastafari. And then you have groups who are based in Egyptology, using Egypt to rationalize the divinity of Haile Selassie, in the same tradition as the god kings of ancient Kemet, like the pharaohs. And then in 2001, when I was searching for the Oracle Nyabingi in Uganda, I went to Rwanda because there's a book written by Horace Campbell called Rasta and Resistance. In the book Rasta and Resistance, Horace Campbell says Nyabingi is an empress of Rwanda. That is what I use as a guide. I went to Rwanda, I spent a week there asking the people if they know Nyabingi, and I could not find a single one who said yes. And then when you go to Uganda, almost every second person, they'll tell you, they know about the legend of Nyabingi, they know the story, but not everyone is really willing to freely discuss with you what Nyabingi is, because after Queen Mohomosa was captured by the British in 1911 and then executed, I think, in 1928. That is when the British declare the Witchcraft Ordinance Act of 1928 against Nyabingi. And then they unleashed the born-again Christians to demonize Nyabingi. So most of the Christianized Baganda don't like to talk about Nyabingi because they consider it to be a demonic thing. So it took me 3 months to really penetrate the whole situation. But while I was in Rwanda, I met a Rasta man called Masada. Now, this is the first Rasta I came across who interpret Rastafari not with the Bible, but with the Quran, the Islamic holy book, the Quran. So even now and then when you reason with him, we'll be saying the Quran say, The Quran say, like most of the Christafarians who always say, the Bible say, the Bible say. So he's now into Islamafari, you know, like the Quran say. The Quran say, whatever he say to rationalize the divinity of His Majesty, why he is Rasta, the levity of Rastafari, is always quoting from the Quran. So I came across those who use the Quran, those who use the Bible, those who use the Bhagavad Gita, the book of the Hare Krishna movement, purely because Hare Krishna is vegetarian, and they talk about Krishna as a God-man, you know. So you find then people even throughout the continent who use different divine sources or sources of divinity, be it Bible, be it the Quran, be it the Bhagavad Gita, be it the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Because again, in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, it makes mention of the name Rasta more than 50 times as a path to enlightenment, as a path from darkness to light, as a way from unconsciousness to consciousness. I've posted extensively about this on Facebook based on the reading of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. I even posted a screenshot of the Egyptian Book of the Dead where they said, Osiris, the Lord of Rasta, R-A-S-T-A. So this is the greatness of Rastafari, that eventually it transcends all religions, and it can be referred with all religious book as much as it transcends on religion, because fundamentally when we rise up in Rastafari, we knew that Rastafari is not a religion. Rastafari is a spiritual way of life. Rastafari is a levity, and to a greater part, Rastafari is a liberation movement, a revolutionary movement, which we saw that in South Africa, because during apartheid, it was not only political parties that were banned, even Rastafari was banned. They find you flying a Rasta flag, you were arrested, and then the police will tear it apart. You know, the Rasta rubber dubs, you know, the Rasta sessions, they were interrupted by the police. So before 1996, Rastafari in South Africa fell squarely in the category of revolutionary movement, subversive movement, seditious movement, treasonous movement. And then come 1996 with the introduction of the Nyabingi Order and Ras Bonajis, and then it transformed into a religious movement through the system of the Churchical Order, where you start to see Rastas quoting a whole lot of biblical verses, because with the Nyabingi you must read 5 Psalms and a creed. You know, you must read 7 Psalms when you light the fire key, and a whole bunch of Psalms to read and whole verses, until to the point where Rastas, when they disagree with one another, they will still go and look for a chapter in the Bible that support them. I know one priest, if you have a disagreement with him, he will spend the whole week looking for a particular verse in the Bible that he's going to read on a Sabbath just for you. You know, so it reached that level that subsequently everything that came after that, you know, Bingi, Bobo, 12 Tribe, were highly biblical, therefore squarely centering Rastafari into the religious category. And in fact, the last largest mass movement was organized by a Zimbabwean Rasta who was in South Africa called Jupiter Ndlovu, where he mobilized. Rastafari was then a mass movement. I mean, you heard about plus minus 3,000 Rastafari marching in the streets with their flags. There is a very beautiful picture of this man and Nelson Mandela in 1994, just shortly after Mandela became a president. The Rastafari held a very, very a huge mass protest and then went into the seat of power in Pretoria and met Mandela. But then after that, with the introduction of the church, Rasta was more religious than revolutionary, both in outlook and in practice. So Rastafari means different things to different people across the board. Even if you find members of the same mansion, Haile Selassie will mean different things to different ones in there. whether they be Bobo, they be 12 tribe, they be Bingi, they be Ethiopian Coptic Church, or any of the manifestations of Rastafari. But what is important is that central to that is Haile Selassie, born on the 23rd of July. Whether they see him as God Almighty, they see him as the second Messiah, or the Christ in his kingly character, or the returned Messiah, or they see him as one of the person in the Trinity, but he's central to the movement and in the influence of one's levity. So yeah, basically, let me just stop there in my presentation. Give thanks.
Give thanks so much, General, for enlightening us on some of the issues, your personal experience, and also the way you see the movement, the 3 dimensions you looked at. And coming back to the point that irrespective of how you see Haile Selassie, His Majesty remains central to the movement. We give thanks for that. So we will now invite comments and questions from Aina, who we've been listening to our panel. So it's time to engage our panel with questions, comments. You can raise your hands if you have any question or comment you want to pass to any of our panel members.
I have a comment.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Most of the commentary has been about the person of His Imperial Majesty, but I don't hear any reference to any timeline and world events. And usually we judge characters and their effects based on world events. And so a lot of the prophecies about the character was about returning at a time when before a new world would be created. And we find that at that time there were a number of events that did destroy the world as it was then, and we had a new dispensation after the Second World War. And here is this character coming just before that and being instrumental for the raising up of a whole continent of people and people in diaspora. Could you comment on that aspect of the life of His Imperial Majesty? Thanks.
Yes, to the panel. Can you comment on the character of His Imperial Majesty and his relationship with world events? Ofwiro, Ras Thau Thau, Dr. Sadia, Jahpila. Anybody want to?
I can take on, and then I give a brief overview of what did the question say? His Imperial Majesty. Say it again. My mind goes blank a lot these days. So, what was the question? His Imperial Majesty's Ras Kofi. Summarize it again for me briefly. Let me take it on.
Yeah. Yes, that, like the character of His Majesty in relation to world events. How
Character
he
of his
suffered.
Yes. Okay. Okay,
Majesty,
great. The character
like
of his
in relation to the Second World War and all that.
Okay. The character of His Majesty in relation to the world. And that's what I was itching to speak on also. I would take it from when His Imperial Majesty was crowned, his coronation in 1930. as King of Kings, Lord of Lords, and the conquering lion of the tribe of Judah, elect of God, rightful ruler. So it was witnessed, His Majesty's coronation was witnessed by 72 nations. So world leaders sent representatives. If the kings and the presidents did not attend the coronation themselves, they sent representatives, the United States, United Kingdom, and all the kingdoms and rulers of the world. 72 nations represented their countries to honor His Imperial Majesty's coronation, and these kings bowed. These rulers and representatives bowed to His Imperial Majesty at his coronation. You can find these videos on YouTube because we are in this dispensation. The truth is all out there. It's documented and it's on video, right? Of 72 nations, His Majesty had to stand in a long procession and shake hands with all these 72 nations who came to bow to His Majesty with the titles of King of Kings, Lord of Lords. Now, when you look at the book of Revelations, chapter 19, verse 16, it says, and he have on his vesture and on his tie a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Okay. So on his coronation, we know that His Majesty was crowned and adorned with robes, with a crown and the robes. So what does it mean for His Majesty to have on his vesture and on his tie a name written King of Kings and Lord of Lords? So on his vesture means on his robe, his outer robe, the long garment of a king. In those days, a royal title will be embroidered or written on the garment, so everyone could see who he was, right? So if everybody could see and 72 nations came to bow, that is just that. And a warrior's sword, on his tie, on the part of the robe that covers the tie, there are two reasons why. A, there were warrior swords. His Majesty was a warrior. We know that he led his army to defend his nation during the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. And to sum it all up, he went to the League of Nations. He gave a powerful speech, which Bob Marley used into a song, War, until the philosophy, which was one race inferior and another superior. We all know that speech, right? So that speech is very popular, and Bob Marley popularized it even more, right? So His Majesty is a warrior, and he's made his case to defend his nation. So the world is watching. As a statesman, he was a brilliant, right? So when a king is riding on a horse, pardon? When a king is riding on a horse, the lower part of the robe drapes over his thigh. It will be an eye level for people standing on the ground. So I'm just explaining how in Revelations, they said that you will see on his robe, on his thigh, on his sword, that he had those titles. His Majesty was crowned. So now, without making it too much, let me now tie that into world affairs. When His Majesty, a Black African man, was crowned King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and then bow down to him, that made the world wake up and see how important Ethiopia and His Majesty was onto the world. And that's how, if I'm correct, Marcus Garvey, we have not mentioned Marcus Garvey tonight, but Marcus Garvey was teaching, look unto Africa where a Black king will be crowned, King of Kings, for the redemption of Africa is at hand. So Marcus Garvey also had written and had taught us that the Chinaman will see his God in his own image. The European will see his God in his own image. The Arab will see his God in his own image, and so on and so forth. It is only the African that sees his God in the image of another. And I think this is where significantly Rastafari movement started, when His Majesty said, look unto Africa. And then we saw he was crowned King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Then who is this King of Kings and Lord of Lords? Is that not the title of Jesus Christ then? Right? So we were in the dispensation of Jesus Christ, and we were given an image of a white man to be Jesus Christ. But now things were changing, where the Bible was saying his hair is as lamb's wool, and his skin, the same revelation, was describing this man as having skin as burnt in the furnace. And his wool was, and his hair was wool. So what does that make him? A black man then. So this is how I believe then the Jamaicans were now looking onto Haile Selassie and saying, okay, if the Chinaman sees their God as a Chinese man and everybody see their God as their own image, then Emperor Haile Selassie, who is actually the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, is the Messiah. He is the one to liberate us. And his works speak for itself, because His Imperial Majesty, like I mentioned earlier, due to white supremacy and slavery and all the apartheid and everything, injustice that is meted against us, he was a symbol of Pan-Africanism. He was a symbol of African liberation, human rights, and Black consciousness. So his coronation also threw light to how important His Majesty was. And I would have to say that during the 20th century, Africa was largely under European colonial rule. Most Black people worldwide had never seen an independent African monarch respected by world leaders. Ethiopia remained one of only 2 African countries never permanently colonized. For African Americans living under Jim Crow segregation, as Rasbiro had mentioned earlier, Haile Selassie represented Black dignity, African sovereignty, intellectual leadership, resistance to white supremacy. Historian Harold Marcus described Selassie as one of the most internationally recognized Black leader of the century, which is in Cambridge Press. So they said that they said that the 1963 United States speech of His Majesty was perhaps his greatest contribution to racial equality, which came through his address to the United Nations. Yeah. So his speech remains one of the greatest condemnations of racism ever delivered by heads of state, Cambridge Press. So His Imperial Majesty influence on civil rights leaders. Many African-American leaders admire Ethiopia's independence and Selassie's resistance against fascist Italy. His struggle inspired Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, W.E.B. Du Bois, Stokely Michael, I can't say his name, Kwame Ture, later known as Kwame Ture.
Thank you.
Black power activists. Yes. So all this, so this is how he influenced world leaders. This is my thought on that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Empress, for that response. Please, we will advise or we'll ask our panel to make their comments quite brief, because it looks like there are a few comments that listeners would want to share with us. We'll take 3 comments from our members, and then we'll come and take responses from the panel, if that's okay. So, Empress Cheryl, you can give us your comment.
Listen. Yes, give thanks. Cheryl Murray Powell, Esquire, cannabis, agricultural, dietary supplement trade, immigration attorney, former international president of the Ethiopian World Federation Incorporated, and then the special representative to the African diaspora for the Crown Council of Ethiopia. I'm going to give greetings from His Imperial Highness Prince Ermias Haile Selassie, for this convening, keeping the legacy of his grandfather alive through Rastafari, and celebrating this 134th Earthstrong of His Imperial Majesty. So greetings from His Imperial Highness. With regard to the last question that was asked by Brother Anthony Brown, abundance of love to Anthony Brown in Manchester, England. There earlier in the talk, I know it took ones and ones a while to come on, but earlier in the talk we had heard from Professor Wadie, who gave a really good breakdown of His Imperial Majesty as it ties into world events. And he started with his birth, and he started with the even preceding his birth, the work of Ras Makonnen, and told of His Imperial Majesty's mother, Sister Elisabeth, or Wazero Elisabeth. So there was that breakdown. He mentioned the League of Sid. He mentioned many of his speeches. I'll just say the League of Nations speech, and also the Brown versus the Board of Education case. So one thing I wanted to call out is if he can emphasize the emphasis on morality that His Imperial Majesty had. There was also a mention of the relationship with India, which His Imperial Majesty saw as a model for Ethiopia with regards to morality and also innovation and technology. So I really wanted to hear more about the collective security, the morality, and then to Brother Anthony's question, just a recap, since many ones and ones weren't on the call, from Professor Wadie about those world events that tie directly into His Imperial Majesty, specifically him requesting wherever he went, where are the Black people, and when he went to Chicago and things like that. So I think many missed that part, but it was very relevant to his life and his character, him seeking out Black people all around the world, and then the integration of schools taking place directly as a result of His Imperial Majesty's visit. I give thanks for the time. Blessed love to all.
Blessed love and give thanks, Emperor Cheryl. Please, any other question before we go to the panel? We want to take 2 more questions or comments. You can.
I just wanted to add a little bit. Can I speak?
Yes, please go ahead, Ras.
Yeah, as far as the question about paradigm shifts, like, the brethren from England, Anthony Brown is talking about a shift, like when His Majesty, when we hear the translation of His Majesty's speech, part of it, where it says the Armageddon is over, it suggests that the world is a certain way and then something else happened. Yeah, right. I think that I want to think of one of the things I can think of when I hear things like that, or the question that was put forward was, there were terms that the world was operating on. I would like to call it Western political cultural discourse, or just the West terms. And Selassie came and put an end to that. See what I'm saying? So that fight to operate within that framework, Selassie said, okay, it's over. We've cleared that. So now we have to operate like we're in another time, and I think that it's something we can take seriously among ourselves, So that's a little bit I was thinking in terms of the paradigm shifts. Like Selassie came and said, there's an end of white rule, if we will see it that way. White terms of rule or living and all that, So that's a little bit I wanted to add to that.
Yes, give thanks, Ras. Please, we want to take another more question or comment before we return to the panel. Does anybody want to ask a question now or comment on Ruben Kush? Ras, please come forward.
Yes, greetings to the gathering. Our praises unto the Most High Emperor Haile Selassie I, giving thanks and praise for this time. Yeah, I just want to make a comment on what was asked by Brother Anthony Brown on the character and judging somebody by their character and what can be highlighted with his character. I more look on that His Majesty had an influence, and I think influence is the word that characterizes His Imperial Majesty. Because we know His Imperial Majesty encouraged us to be on the stage of world affairs. So that means always knowing what's happening, who's doing what. And then we see the contributions that His Imperial Majesty made and gave, not just to Black peoples of the world, but to the world in general. His stance and being part of the League of Nations, and then seeing the real side of the League of Nations. He brought the League of Nations to a close and then brought in the United Nations. His Imperial Majesty's influence on the continent in establishing the OAU. He saw the other African countries in a state of being colonized and not having sovereignty in their own right. And it was his influence, as well as other African leaders, that brought about that sense of one Africa, brought about that sense of being responsible for your own country. And then we also see the influence that His Imperial Majesty had on the diaspora. The speaker before, one of the speakers before, mentioned the visits of His Imperial Majesty to America, and His Imperial Majesty asking to meet the Black communities. His Imperial Majesty knew what was happening in America. He saw the support from America towards Ethiopia in Ethiopia's time of need. And he gave the Black peoples of the world a sense of honoring Ethiopia and honoring their own legacy by giving collective security and also encouraging ones to organize and centralize. America was going through a segregation period, and His Imperial Majesty came and told ones to organize and centralize. He didn't just say organize and centralize, he gave the tool necessary to organize and centralize. And that was the Ethiopian World Federation. And the Ethiopian World Federation or organization was as strong as the UNIA in terms of membership. And sometimes history amongst I and I as Black people don't reflect on the influence that the Ethiopian World Federation had on Black America. And also on the Caribbean. His Imperial Majesty would invite singers and performers to Ethiopia. And in the late 40s, he invited Mamie Richardson. Mamie Richardson was the international organizer of the Ethiopian World Federation. And when His Imperial Majesty visited America in 1954, he had counsel with the International Council of the Ethiopian World Federation at their convention. And one of the suggestions that was put forward at that convention was that the Ethiopian World Federation needed to bring more youth into the organization so that they could use the constitution to better themselves, better their communities, and be able to be self-sufficient and have empowerment. So Mamie Richardson, under the instructions of His Imperial Majesty, traveled to the Caribbean, Jamaica being the first island that she went, and they established the Ethiopian World Federation. At that time, the Rastafari movement was already, in existence, you could say. And His Imperial Majesty was well aware of that fact. A land grant was given in 1948. A delegation was sent by the Jamaican government and the University of the West Indies. They traveled, and Ethiopia was one of the countries that they visited. So His Imperial Majesty always understood what the Rastafari movement was about. And he never denounced the Rastafari community. He encouraged the Rastafari movement, and it's evolved to where it is now, as Ras Thau Thau has eloquently described. But these are the influences that His Imperial Majesty has had on Black peoples of the world and on the world in general. His Imperial Majesty was honored by different royal families all over the world. So in 1930, when he was crowned Emperor of Ethiopia, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah, a lot of the dignitaries that bowed in acknowledgement of this were royal families from different parts of the world. So His Majesty's influence was great, more than what was actually put out there. As a king of a country, you're going to travel, you're going to meet other kings, other presidents from around the world. So you're recognized in that regard. But there was another regard that His Majesty is to be really revered for. And that is bringing that consciousness within the Black race to look to Africa and build Africa in the way that we feel Africa should be built. On an economic level, on a political level, and on a community level, on an educational level, agricultural level. His Majesty was an influence to Black peoples of the world to look at these things for redemption for ourselves. So there's so many aspects of his character that can be drawn on, but the influence on the Black peoples of the world is one that we must all acknowledge, no matter how we see His Imperial Majesty, whether we see him as the living God, whether we see him as Christ in his kingly character, whether we see him as just a king of the Black race. So there's so many titles that His Majesty has. So the influence for me personally is the number one. That influence I can explain to my parents. That influence I can explain to my children. So it's more about the influence that His Majesty has, especially on the Black peoples of the world. Give enough thanks and give thanks for the opportunity. Blessed love. Rastafari.
Yes, give thanks. Haile Selassie. Give thanks, Ruben Kush, for your contribution. I'll return to the panel to give us their take on the questions and comments that have come up. So, Prof. Wiro, if you can come in. Prof. Wiro first.
Yes, I give that Rastafari, right. So, I want to respond to, I think, a question about the character of His Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie I the First. His Majesty exhibited kindness at all levels to all peoples that he came in contact with. In addition to that, His Majesty always used the lens of Africa. He saw the world through the lens of Africa. His Majesty stood for a life of dignity. His Majesty was highly intellectual in his engagements. And His Majesty was a superb strategist. In fact, the only reason that the Italians won the war between 1935-36 and 1945, because the Ethiopians were winning. All the Ethiopians had put a superb strategy under His Majesty in place and were winning the war. And it was because when the Italians saw that the Ethiopians were winning the war that they decided that they were going to use ypirite gas, which is a deadly gas, which burns your skin when it touches your skin. It killed so much cattle and people in Ethiopia. And it also actually was sprayed on His Majesty himself. It burned his own skin. And it was this that made the Italians temporarily come out as the victors in that war. But to speak to the strategies of His Majesty, I want to share a little story. There was the ruler of the province of Sidamo, which I've spoken to about earlier on, which His Majesty himself was a prior ruler of that province as well. And his name was Balacha Safo. And he had made the economic fortunes of Sidamo dwindle. And so His Majesty summoned him. His Majesty had then assumed work in Addis Ababa. So His Majesty summoned him to Addis Ababa. Now, of course, Balacha Safo heading to Addis Ababa, saying to himself, how dare you summon me to Addis Ababa? I am going to teach you a lesson. So Balacha Safo went with 10,000 of his troops, and they camped in the mountains around Addis Ababa, whilst Balacha Safo went to meet His Majesty Haile Selassie. And, Haile Selassie was talking to him, asking him questions. He threw a banquet in his honor, all that stuff. Balacha Safo was intentional in bringing the army because he expected to do something with the army that he had brought. His Majesty had already read his mind, so to speak. I'm not saying literally, but I'm just saying that he knew that Balacha Safo was capable of such. So whilst they were dining and having the banquet, he sent emissaries to go and talk to the troops that Balacha Safo had brought with him to eventually attack His Majesty. And the emissaries were able to convince the troops to leave the mountains of Addis Ababa and return to Sidamo. So when Balacha Safo, the banquet was over in the evening, everything, discussions held and all that stuff. When he came back to go talk to his troops and whatever plans that he had to implement those plans, when he went, the troops were gone. They were no longer there. And he found himself outwitted by His Majesty in his calm and unassuming posture. So this is just an example, but there are many other examples, even long-term examples. His Majesty, for instance, was heavily criticized when he decided to leave Ethiopia at the height of the Italian invasion and travel to England. But he was looking at the long term. What do I need to do now to secure the sovereignty, the independence, and the future prosperity of Ethiopia? So he left and went to Bath, England, from where he worked tirelessly to convince the British government and also African troops, because most of the time when we talk about this involvement of the British, it seems as if it was the British themselves who were helping His Majesty. But no, it was people from all over Africa, from Sudan, from Ghana, from Nigeria, from Sierra Leone, who were under the rulership of the British during those colonial times, who actually fought with His Majesty through Sudan and entered Ethiopia on the 5th of May, 1941, exactly 5 years from the day that, he had to board the ship and leave for England. So in terms of strategy, these are two great examples of the character of His Majesty in terms of strategy. I also want to say that during the time of Jim Crow, which is segregation in the United States, presidents of Black countries were not really welcome to the White House. There was a place that they were welcome to meet Black dignitaries when they came to the United States. And this place was the house of the first African-American millionaire, the palace, I should say, Madam C.J. Walker. It is very interesting to know that in front of Madam C.J. Walker's palace is the symbol of the Lion of Judah, the Ethiopian lion that is etched into the walls. So Ethiopia and His Majesty at that time and even today stood for something that was very important to the Black race. Now, the president of Liberia, when he visited the United States, he was hosted in Madam C.J. Walker's house, or I should say her palace, because that's what it really was. And many other Black dignitaries from around the world who were not welcome to the White House were invited to Madam C.J. Walker's palace to have discussions with the African-American dignitaries. So in response, I would say that the character of His Majesty is something that we should seek to emulate. It's something that we should seek to make it an integral part of our own decision-making processes. It is something that we should learn from his development as a young person, through his rulership of provinces of Ethiopia, through his attainment of or assumption of office as King of Kings of Ethiopia. And as has been mentioned, the impact that he made prior to the formation of the Organization of African Unity. Because most of the time, when we talk about African unity, we try to think of it as starting in 1963. His Majesty was making overtures to the Western world, the Blacks in the diaspora, as early as 1919, as has already been shown. And as we are in this conference today, it is the impact of His Majesty that has brought us together in this conference today. And I think that the title of this the theme of this conference could not have been better than the impact of His Majesty. And this impact is also very important to the continent of Africa. It is very noteworthy that Ghana, being the first country south of the Sahara to gain independence from the British under the premiership of Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. When Kwame Nkrumah gained independence, the first country he visited was Ethiopia, to His Imperial Majesty. The flags of most African countries are red, gold, green. That is in honor of Ethiopia, His Imperial Majesty. The work of His Imperial Majesty is felt. His Majesty actually took the colonial powers of Namibia, present-day Namibia, to court. Now, just check this out. His Majesty is a, ruler in Ethiopia, taking the colonial powers in Namibia to court over their colonization efforts. His Majesty's presence in Malawi cannot be overestimated. His Majesty granted Nelson Mandela and his accomplices who were working against apartheid in Southern Africa passports and also a gun to assist him in his efforts and their compatriots' efforts over there. We can go on and on and on. In fact, Liberia is another example. And we talk about the Organization of African Unity. And in this organization, there were two main camps, the Casablanca group and the Monrovia group. Again, I'm talking about when we talk about the long-term vision of His Majesty, right? Now, we have the Monrovia group, Casablanca group, one group being seen as the more radical, who wanted, Africa unity now. The other one saying, let's take our time and work towards that unity. His Majesty joined the group that was seen as the reactionaries. But again, he was looking at the long-term vision. And through his presence, he was able to bring the two groups together to come to Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, in 1963 to usher in the Organization of African Unity to promote the unity of Africans worldwide. So if we have to talk about the impact of His Majesty, we can go on and on and on. But, I would like to pause here for a minute to give other people an opportunity to also share. So give thanks.
Yes, give thanks, Prof. Wiru. There is also a question to shed more light on morality, international morality, and collective security of His Majesty. And Cheryl requested that you shed more light on international morality and collective security as practiced by him.
So thank you for the question, Empress Cheryl. It's a great question. So His Majesty is actually, as I said earlier on, the one who coined these terms, international morality and collective security. And by that is meant that if there is a world organization to which countries belong, then those countries who belong to this world organization, initially in this case, the League of Nations, then it behoves that every member state should be protected. The security has to be collective. When something happens to one member state, the entire membership of this world body, from His Majesty's viewpoint, needed to come to the assistance of the countries which were under any kind of attack or suffering. Now, His Majesty, in talking about international morality, also links this international morality with collective security. In other words, if there is a moral standard for which all nations have agreed to embrace, then that moral standard should be international and should be acted on internationally at all times. I think for many of the member states, as we see in the world today, that was a concept that was foreign to them. Even today, we hear countries talk about we're working in our country's interests. We are in that country for our own interests, right? But His Majesty was looking at it from a different perspective. There has to be a moral standard to which all countries adhere to. And this moral standard is what he referred to as international morality. And that international morality is also inextricably linked to collective security. And that is what the League of Nations was supposed to do, that it eventually failed to do, which resulted in its collapse, as had been said earlier on by His Majesty Haile Selassie. That was what the Organization of African Unity was supposed to do. And as we can see, it's not living up to that mandate. That is what the United Nations was supposed to do. And as we can see, is not living up to that mandate. So if these organizations are not living up to these mandates of collective security and international morality, then, we can also look into the future today and say that just as the League of Nations perished because they did not live up to these mandates, that these organizations will also face the same fate. And so there's a little light, Empress Cheryl, on collective security and international morality. I give thanks for your question. And I want to publicly really appreciate the leadership that you have given to the Ethiopian World Federation during your tenure as the president. From afar, I can see a lot of positive changes that you have made, long-lasting changes that will actually bring the Ethiopian World Federation to where it is supposed to be. So I give thanks for your works, and I give thanks for the question.
Yes, give thanks, Professor. I've learned so much from you. I'm humbled by your words, and that was the intent, to use my time wisely and in alignment with His Imperial Majesty's vision and his will. So I give thanks for the kind words, and I'm still going to be doing the Emperor's work wherever I am. Blessed love, Rastafari.
Yes, we'll go to other panel members, but Sifiwe Baleka has a comment. We want to take that. Before that, Empress Zaini said not only were they not welcomed, but the U.S. Constitution considers a black man is only 3/5 of a human being. That's some information out there. Give thanks, Empress Zaini. Yeah, so Sifiwe Baleka, you can ask your question now.
Abene, thank you. Salamta, Tanastalin, Igziabir Masgan. It's more of a comment and a contribution than a question. I want to thank you for this platform. I joined the discussion a little bit late, but I heard talk about the Emperor's visit to Chicago, which has inspired me to make this contribution. For the record, my name is Sipiwe Baleka. I was once known as Ras Nathaniel. I currently serve as the Afro-descendant theocratic special envoy extraordinary and reparations expert, but I am also the elect of records for the Star Order of Ethiopia. which is the original Rastafari organization that was founded in Chicago in 1919. My contribution tonight is to emphasize that not only the diplomatic relation and the influence and impact that Haile Selassie had on Afro-descendant people in the West, but also our impact on His Imperial Majesty. I would like to remind all of us that 1 year after the birth of Lige Tafari Makonnen in 1892, 1 year after that, in 1893, was the Chicago Congress on Africa. Africans from the continent came to Chicago and met with Afro-descendant leaders from the West, and they developed a secretariat. Included in that secretariat was the Afro-descendant from Haiti, whose name was Benito Sylvain, who ended up becoming the aide-de-camp for Emperor Menelik. Right after the Battle of Adwa, there was a meeting between Benito Sylvain and Emperor Menelik. And they decided that there needed to be a grand Pan-African international celebration of the victory of Adwa. And that is what became known as the first Pan-African Congress that was held in London in 1900. The organizers for that was the Secretariat of the Chicago Congress of Africa. So the modern Pan-African movement, as we know it today, is directly emerged from that. That was 1900. This Benito Sylvain, at that point, introduced the African-American William Ellis, who was the champion at that time in the early 1900s of the repatriation movement in the United States of America. Benito Sylvain introduced William Ellis to Benito Sylvain in Ethiopia. And it was at that time that they introduced to Emperor Menelik that it was Martin Delany in 1853 who said, "Africa for the Africans, those at home and abroad, and black men to rule them." At that time, Emperor Menelik's Minister of Foreign Affairs was Ras Makonnen, the father of Lige Tafari Makonnen. This is where the emperor first became introduced and became aware of the black people of the West. Following that, in 1908, a black man named Daniel Robert Alexander from Chicago was the first person known on record to repatriate to Ethiopia in 1908. He came carrying copies of the Chicago Defender newspaper. At that time, as the first Black American in Ethiopia, he was well known and was often invited to the court of Emperor Menelik, where he brought these Chicago Defender newspapers. During those meetings at the court, Emperor Menelik's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ras Makonnen, was present, and he brought his son, Lige Tafari Makonnen. And that is where the emperor first learned about the details of Black people in the West, and specifically Black people in Chicago. This is 1908. This is the reason why in 1919, as regent and plenipotentiary, Rastafari sent the Abyssinian mission to the United States, and specifically to Chicago. In Chicago, the Abyssinian mission learned that it was the Black American, Reverend Webb from Chicago, who had published a pamphlet called The Coming of the Universal Black King, as supported by biblical prophecies. This Reverend Webb was teaching that the Bible said a universal Black king was to come. And this Reverend Webb had gone to the UNIA and taught this to the UNIA and Marcus Garvey. At that same time that the Abyssinian mission was in Chicago, another Black man in Chicago named Prophet Redding witnessed the Abyssinian mission and joined the mission when it went to New York and returned to Chicago and explained that the Treaty of Friendship that was being renewed between Emperor Menelik and the United States government would provide first-class citizenship and rights, that Ethiopians in America had to be treated as first-class citizens, and Americans visiting Ethiopians would have to be treated with all rights and duties. The Prophet Redding realized in 1919 in Chicago that if he renounced his American Jim Crow citizenship and pledged his allegiance to the government of Ras Thau Thau, that he would be accorded rights and privileges that he did not have as an American Jim Crow citizenship. And so therefore, as a result, he had organized Black community in Chicago in the Star Order of Ethiopia. And that 1919 mission, Abyssinian mission sent by Regent and Plenipotentiary Rastafari, was the first offer of repatriation by Rastafari to the Black people of the West to return home. The Prophet Redding organized around this, burned an American flag, hoisted a red, gold, and green Ethiopian flag, and said, "We pledge allegiance to the government of Rastafari." This is how the Rastafari movement started. As a result of that demonstration, there was a gunfight. Police officers were shot and killed, and eventually Prophet Redding was captured and hanged, becoming the first Rastafari martyr. As a result of this, the movement then spread east to New York, where Leonard Howell learned about the Rastafari movement and then brought it back to Jamaica. It is for this reason that in 1954, as Emperor Haile Selassie, he returned and made that unscheduled visit to South Park Baptist Church on 3722 South Park Avenue in Chicago. Before that, and before Mamie Richardson, as emperor, he sent Madame Sahara on an 18-month tour of 18 different cities in America to promote a land grant and the repatriation offer to the Black people of the West, and particularly to Chicago. It was also because it was Colonel John C. Robinson, the Black eagle, who went to Ethiopia and served as Emperor Haile Selassie's pilot during the Italian invasion, and then afterwards stayed and trained the first 83 pilots that became the Ethiopian Airlines that we know today. It was because of the Ethiopia to Chicago direct connection that emerged what became the Rastafari movement as we know it today. And it is the reason why Emperor Haile Selassie came to Chicago and offered a house rent-free, free plane tickets for you and your family, a competitive salary, 3 months paid vacation, and return tickets to Ethiopia. This was the 1954 repatriation offer that was made to the Black people of the West in Chicago. There's a reason And I want to emphasize today that the diplomatic relationship between the Black people of the West and Ethiopia, and particularly His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie, was a two-way street. This is also the reason that when the Italians invaded Ethiopia, there were volunteers in Jamaica who volunteered to join the 5,000 Black Americans in Chicago to go to Ethiopia and defend Ethiopian sovereignty. Unfortunately, today, this history was suppressed. So the true origins of the Rastafari movement is not really understood and known, and people mistakenly believe that it started in Jamaica, even though in 1940, Leonard Howell himself told the Jamaican Gleaner newspaper that he learned the tenets of Rastafari while he was in the United States and then brought it to Jamaica. So I wanted to take this opportunity to add this contribution, right? And then also that I dropped a link in the chat. We did an analysis of every single reference to international morality and collective security that the emperor made in the collected speeches of Haile Selassie. Every single reference we have compiled in chronological order as a reminder and a warning to United States President Donald Trump and Israel Prime Minister Netanyahu, who violated the very principles of collective security when the United States invaded Venezuela, and also when the Israeli engaged in the genocide against Palestinians. The United States then launched this attack in Iran. We wanted to remind the world community that if the emperor prophesied at the League of Nations and that prophecy came true and 50 million Europeans died in the European savage war that we call World War II, if he prophesied then and it came true, that it behooves us now to revisit what he said about violating the principle of collective security and what will happen now if the world does not stand up to the Israel and defend the principle of collective security. Thank you.
Yes, give thanks so much, brother Sifue, for your contribution and highlights. I'm sure we have learned a lot from what you shared, and also the link that you shared with us. I'm sure many of us will copy and follow up with the references and update ourselves with some of this information. Is there any other comment, question, before we go to panel members like Thau Thau, Jahpila, to share their give us their response to some of the comments that we have passed? We'd like to take a few more comments before we go back to the panel. Yeah, so if Jah beloved, my lord, please come in.
Yes, Nanano, give thanks. I have a quick question for General Thau Thau, but before that, I also have a little contribution to make. So when we talk about the impact of His Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie, one other very important thing to note is that at the time where Africans did not have, or at least in the eyes of the West, Africans did not have any rights to any real estate in the world, right? All our lands were under colony, and the only land that was not under colony was Ethiopia. And not only was Ethiopia not under colony, but it was also respected as an independent nation. So Haile Selassie's Ethiopia represented Africa's real estate in the world, and therefore represents our sense of pride, from which the whole rise of Black Power can definitely tap into for a source of power, energy, and all of that. Now, my question to General Thau Thau, when you come in next to speak, is I heard you speak about a brethren who was looking at Rastafari from the Quran. I know that you probably would not be the best person to ask to go into details or anything like that. But I'm just curious if he shared anything that resonated with you from the Quran about His Majesty that you can share with us. Give thanks.
Yes, give thanks, Jah beloved, for your question. Please, any more question, and then we'll return to the panel. Want to take one last question or comment? Is any delegate L12? Is it Queen Mother Moses? Yeah, Queen Mother Moses, you have an answer. Please, your question or comment.
The comment after the answer that General Thau Thau is going to give about the Quran and Rastafari.
Yes, Empress, please go ahead with your comments. Queen Mother Moses.
Okay, my comment, as we say, give us the teachings of His Majesty, and His Majesty left us a speech that as king, he is equally Christian, Muslim, and pagan. Pagan being indigenous spirituality. Whichever community has indigenous spirituality, whether it be African or Asian, he has related that he relates to them. And I remember the presentation that had been given where they were representatives from all of those different spirituality who shared how they see and praise His Majesty. For all those words, I, Empress Queen Mother Moses, Dr. Marcia Olive Stewart, give thanks.
Yes, give enough thanks, Queen Mother Moses. Thank you so much. So we will now return to our panel, Ras Thau Thau, General Thau Thau, and Jahpila. We would like to hear your responses to some of the questions that have come up, some directed to you, some not directed to you, but we would like to hear your views on some of these questions and comments. Yes. So General Thau Thau, please, you can come forward if you're ready.
Yeah. Yes, no, give thanks, Rastafari. It is quite it's quite important. I must acknowledge what Elder Ruben Kush said, what Ras Anthony Brown said, what the Empress earlier also said, and also what the professor said, and what I concur completely and fully with Ras Pure Baleka recount of history, because this is exactly the same history I read and studied about Ethiopia, the Rastafari movement, Chicago contribution, New York, Leonard Howell influence. And I must also acknowledge Queen Mother Moses, that you look so beautiful with your turban. It's first time I see you with your head wrap. You look so beautiful. Yeah. So, few things comes in. What Ras Piwe outlined is history, which is very important because when we're dealing with Haile Selassie, we're dealing with a historical figure. We're not dealing with a mythological figure. We're not dealing with figments of our own imaginations. We're not dealing with, our own religious creation. So it is important really to follow history. And then also, I need to historically put something into perspective, which the Empress said in the context of, we need to understand that Rastafari have its own narrative of Haile Selassie, which cannot be found anywhere else except within Rastafari. And that narrative is not always historical. It is spiritual, it is theological, and it's probably Rastafari. Like, for instance, the notion that 72 nations were at His Majesty's coronation obviously is not historically correct. When you read the autobiography of His Majesty Haile Selassie, that is Haile Selassie now writing his own history. There is a difference between biography and autobiography. Autobiography is when someone really writing his story, which is called My Life and Ethiopia's Progress. Iweted na Ethiopia emerger in America. So His Majesty, in the book, in the autobiography of His Majesty, is 2 volumes, volume 1 and volume 2. Now, the second volume, it cover all the way to the Italian War. And the first volume, it cover from birth, go through the coronation, and the beginning of His Majesty establishing his government. Now, His Majesty recorded that there were 12 nations at the coronation. And the reason of them being there is that they were all nations who had signed and concluded treaties with Ethiopia. So the 72 nation is something that is just said within the Rastafari movement. But when it is juxtaposed against history, it's not historically factual, which brings us to the point that the reality of Haile Selassie does not require us to create extra stuff. The name itself, the person, the life, times, and character of His Majesty says a lot. In fact, there's a book called The Life, Character, and Times of Haile Selassie by Lokot, which is covering, is a biography of His Majesty, not an autobiography. So in the autobiography, His Majesty explained why there were 12 nations at his coronation, because all of those were those who have concluded their treaties with Ethiopia. Then let me go to the main subject of this comment, which is the character of His Majesty. His Majesty has had the most impeccable character from his birth, coming through his young age, even when he was a student of Abba Jaraseu. He has a lot to say about His Majesty's character. When he was the governor of Hara, when he was Dijazmak, when he was the governor of Hara, when he was a Ras, all the way to the Negus of Ethiopia before he became the Negus Negast. And also what the Empress said earlier was that His Majesty had these titles, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, which therefore make him a Jesus or create the dispensation of Jesus Christ. But the King of Kings, Conquering Lion of Judah title is a Solomonic title, which was first carried by Menelik I and Haile Selassie was the 225th to carry that title. So therefore, that argument, that reasoning will then suggest that each one of the kings of Ethiopia were Jesus Christ by virtue of the King of Kings title. But when you go biblically, prophetically, the Bible makes emphasis on his name. You know, Rastafari is a new name. You go even to the book of Enoch. The book of Enoch is the only book actually that is an extra biblical book that for me I came across a name that is directly translated to Rastafari. You know, one to be feared, because when Enoch was on his journey to the heavens, you know, first heaven, second heaven to the seventh heaven, he asked, who's that one sitting on the seventh heaven? And then they said, he is the one who is to be feared. Basically, Ras Teferi. Direct translation. So now we go to the character of His Majesty in international affairs, as Ras Anthony Brown asked about the character of His Majesty in international affairs. It is true what Elder Ruben Kuch said about influence, that His Majesty's influence was so deep that at the League of Nations, His Majesty was the only black sovereign in that institution of the League of Nations. It was just a white people's club. His Majesty went in, then interrupted that and introduced important principles like collective security, you know, world peace, international morality, and argued that in the case of Ethiopia as a case study. And then his influence extended to the point that when you read the book called The 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene, at page 25 to 27, Haile Selassie is the only black individual that Robert Greene is using. The 48 Laws of Power give 48 different advices about power, how to maintain power, how to accumulate, how to get power and keep it, and all of that. He used different type of sovereigns, Louis the 16th, all these different European and Chinese and Asian sovereigns. But the only African sovereign that he mentioned there is His Majesty Haile Selassie. And on the basis of his character, on the basis of his astuteness, on the basis of his strategy, as Prof said that His Majesty was the greatest strategist, which is true. And then when we go to, we continue with this character, between 1950s and 60s, His Majesty was voted the best dressed man in the world about 3 times. So His Majesty's intellectual acumen was well recognized worldwide, yet without even a high school education. But he was the most intellectual. And then we look at statesmanship, even how he took Ethiopia to the League of Nations first, and then the United Nations second. And him and General Smuts, they were one of the 4 field marshals. During the Second World War, there were only 4 field marshals. It was His Majesty Haile Selassie, General John Smuts of South Africa, and then Montgomery, Field Marshal Montgomery, and of the British, and Rommel of the German. I don't know, Montgomery is British American, yeah. And then there was Rommel of the Germans. These are the 4 field marshals. So he was not only a statesman, but he was also a military personnel who attained the highest military qualification, which is the field marshal, meaning that the head of state is in the head of his army in the battlefield. He doesn't send soldiers to go and fight, but he goes along with them to fight. And then we also So the role that His Majesty played, apart from this, here we're talking about international now. When we speak of League of Nations, we speak of United Nations, we're speaking on the international level, but then we bring it back to the continent. When we bring the role and the character and the influence and the power of His Majesty, again, His Majesty, there were two groups prelude to the OAU, the Monrovia group and the Casablanca group. Now, His Majesty was part of the Monrovia group, actually. He did not necessarily bring the two groups being outside of them. No, he was part of the Monrovia group. So the Monrovia group was made up of 17 countries in Africa, and the Casablanca group was made up of 7 countries. So the Casablanca group was formed in January 1961, and then the Monrovia group was formed in May 1961, same year. Now, the Casablanca group, which Kwame Nkrumah, Algeria, Egypt, and others belongs to, was more about African unity now. So the Monrovia group, which Haile Selassie, Julius Nyerere, and others were part of, they were of the view that gradual first economic integration and then gradual African unification, with a whole lot of cautioning that they were cautioning against. So, in fact, OAU was formed in 1963, and in 1964, there was the Cairo summit, because the 1963 one was in Addis Ababa, 1964 was the Cairo summit, where the OAU passed the resolution AHG/RSE, resolution 16, in brackets 1, that was in July 1964. From the 17th of July to the 21st of July, they sit at the summit as its first ordinary session in Cairo, Egypt. The resolution declared that all member states must respect the borders that existed when they gained national independence. Now, what were the key details of the 1964 resolution? It was adopted on the 21st of July 1964 by the OAU Assembly of Heads of State and Government in Cairo. So the core rule was member states pledged to respect all borders existing on their achievement of national independence. Now, there was a legal principle. The legal principle was based on what in Latin they say ut possidetis, which is basically as you possess, so you may continue to possess. Meaning administrative lines drawn during colonial rule become permanent international boundaries. Now, why did the OAU make this particular choice? One was preventing war. African leaders feared that trying to redraw the continent's map will spark endless ethnic and territorial wars. 2 was the consideration of stability, that preserving existing borders provided a clear, practical way to maintain peace and state security during the fragile post-independence era. The third consideration was stopping outside interference. Leaders wanted to block foreign powers from exploiting border fight to divide African nations. So basically, this were one of the things that, as we speak of Organization of African Unity in the context of the first chairmanship of Haile Selassie, remember Haile Selassie housed the OAU in Ethiopia. Haile Selassie paid its staff members for the next 12 months, and no African country contributed anything. Haile Selassie chaired its first 12 months rotational system that they had in place. and also guided it from its inception, and bringing together these diverse or these two groups that were pulling on two different directions, and to guide a process to how will eventually and ultimately this African unity should be achieved. That, you know, there are certain sentiments, they are good to, you know, they are good when you sensationalize, but don't look at the complexity of Africa. Africa is made up of about 3,000 ethnic groups, many different political system. Even now, Africa is still largely Europhone. It's still divided according to European blocs like the Anglophone, Francophone, Lusophone Africa, and the Maghreb region there in the north, which is basically the Arab states. So there's, through the wisdom of His Majesty, look at the complexity of Africa, which is basically the macrocosm of Ethiopia, which Ethiopia is just the microcosm of the whole continent, because Ethiopia has got about 82 ethnic groups, what the white men call tribes. But Africa has got about 3,000 of them, divided along religious orientations, political orientations, border conflict, resources conflict, and so many other emotive issues. So in his divine wisdom, he foresaw even what is going on now, that this is something that needs careful consideration and careful planning and careful approach. Otherwise, it is going to create a disaster. And therefore, they took on that particular resolution and even convinced hardliners like Osajefo Kwame Nkrumah, who was basically the leading force of African unity now. You know, we need to have a United States of Africa now. But then His Majesty, in his eagle eye observation and reality, remember this was the most experienced statesman. He survived the League of Nations. He dealt with European powers before Second World War. And he went on to deal with European powers after Second World War, when there was no single independent state in Africa except Ethiopia and Liberia. So he understood Western diplomacy, and rightfully so. The professor said His Majesty was the first African head of state to be welcomed in the White House. He's the first black man that the white men treated him as an equal. It wasn't for trivial reasons, but purely based on his strong character, strong influence, high level of intellect, his strategy, his well-acknowledged strategic posture. So this then helped to shape the narrative of liberation. His Majesty campaigned against, actually actively and strongly, campaigned against the kicking out of South Africa from the Commonwealth countries, I think in 1972. And in the same 1972, His Majesty closed the Israeli embassy in Ethiopia, and actively supported liberation movements, and have the OAU establish the Liberation Committee, which supported liberation movements. And also, as the professor said, that he gave Mandela a passport, he gave him a pistol, and also the boots. Because when you visit the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg at Mondio, there you're going to get these three items: the pistol that His Majesty gave Mandela, the Lion of Judah stamped passport, and the boots. And the training that he was offered to go on to become the first commander-in-chief of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the ANC Liberation Army. But also, one of the things that we also observe in terms of the character of His Majesty and the influence, as Elder Ruben Kush also succinctly explained, that his influence transcended all times. His influence is not limited to the Rastafari movement, as it was then and even now. His influence extended across many areas of our social existence. And I've came across a lot of people who cite up Haile Selassie without necessarily being Rastafari, without necessarily being dreadlocks, but who have him in very, very serious regard. Now, also to answer the elder's question about the Rastaman I met in Rwanda in 2001, Ras Masada, who was quoting the Quran, who was using the Quran as the basis of reference for him. I did not really, that was like 25 years ago, I did not really have the opportunity to memorize. I mean, this is a person I stayed with about 5 days in Rwanda. I did not have the opportunity to memorize the exact surahs of the Quran, the exact verses for me to repeat them. But yes, what he said to me as he was quoting the Quran made sense as you listen to the Rasta man who quoted the Bible. It made sense. He had references that he used, which as somebody who grew up in a Christian South Africa and in a Christian family, it is easy for me to remember biblical verses than to remember the surahs of the Quran, because we were not brought up in that environment. But this was the Rasta man I met who quoted the Quran in his rationalization of Rastafari. And whatever he said really made sense to me. Hence, it created a sort of paradigm shift. And to reiterate on what Queen Mother Moses said in quoting His Majesty, that His Majesty said, yes, I am a king. Yes, I'm a Christian, but as a king, I am equally a Christian, a Muslim, and a pagan. So by that time already, I was also familiar with that particular speech. So that is why it made sense for me that, well, he's well within his right to quote the Quran and arrive at the same conclusion that the one who read the Bible arrive at the same conclusion, because him quoting the Quran does not take him away from His Majesty's divinity. He doesn't say Haile Selassie is not divine. He's quoting his Quran and still say Haile Selassie is the Almighty God. As much as I met the Rasta who are pagan, as Queen Mother Moses explained, that pagan in this context is basically in reference to indigenous spirituality. But then I'll speak from an African spirituality. There's a book written by an Ethiopian by the name of Tishale Tibebu. It's called The Making of Modern Ethiopia, 1896 to 1974, where it shows that the Ethiopian society was divided into three, the Christian, the Muslim, and the pagan. And in the context of Ethiopia, the pagan, they are referring to unconverted tribes of Ethiopia, the practitioners of indigenous Ethiopian African spirituality. Even when they use a reference that Ethiopia is an island of Christianity surrounded by sea of pagan, obviously Ethiopia is a country in Africa surrounded by a whole lot of African countries that were not yet converted to Christianity. They were still into their indigenous African spirituality until the Western missionaries came in and converted them to Christianity. So within that particular context, I understood what the Rastaman, Ras Masada, was saying, although there was another outrageous statement he really loved to make. Ras Masada, whenever we go for lunch, he will buy himself his plate of meat, and then he buy me vegetables and those cassavas and matokes that they eat in Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, Tanzania, Kenya areas, the porridge made up of bananas. Apart from plantain, there is a thing called matoke. So whenever you buy me these vegetables to eat, whenever people ask him, why do you eat meat and this Rasta man is eating vegetables? He will say, oh, he come from South Africa. They've been killing white people, so meat is still smelling on his nostrils. But I thought when I visited Rwanda that time, Rwanda was just barely 5 years out of the greatest genocide ever. So if there's anybody who will still be smelling the smell of blood, it should be him in Rwanda than me from South Africa. But yeah, he was a very interesting character. He was traveling without passport. We know he will move from Burundi, Rwanda, Uganda, Kenya to Tanzania without passport. Every time when he reached the border, he told them that I was never part of your partitioning of Africa. I've got my family on the other side of the border. So they used to refer to him as the only free Rastaman. So he was a very eccentric. He was a mechanic. He was a jolly person, but he was very, very steeped in the Quran as a Rastaman, which was a very new phenomenon for me, but also a paradigm shift. It did not cost me to judge him, as I was very much a Bible quoting Rasta then. But at that particular time, I was able to understand from what His Majesty said that, even as a king, I'm all of that. So my interpretation has always been that if His Majesty is a Christian, a Muslim, and a pagan, then he's none of that, because there is no way you can be a Christian and a pagan at the same time. And there's no way you can be a Muslim and a pagan at the same time. So if he's all of that, he's none of that. So in my view, was like that is Majesty at his greatest diplomatic way, that his God Almighty is above all of that. He can't be confined to all of that. God belongs to no religion. So yeah, I understood it within that context, my elder, to answer your question with the Rastaman. His name is Ras Masada from Rwanda, who was quoting the Quran as to what is it that I found in the Quran. I can just remember that whatever he said to me then made sense, but did not make sense enough for me to start reading the Bible, Quran, or quote the Quran, because I understood that is something that he was brought up in. I mean, you go to Zanzibar and in the coast of Tanzania, like Dar es Salaam, those Rastaman, those dreadman, they have a system almost like the rent-a-dread thing that takes place in Jamaica, where you see the dreadman walking around the coast and then being a tour guide or of assistance to white women and all of this type of thing. So when you go to Zanzibar, you get that particular situation that these dreads that you normally interact with during Ramadan, they put on their Islamic kofia and they stuff their dreads under their kofias and they go to the mosque and they start to do their Islamic hadith, and then they start to do their Islamic obligation. So I think it is not a unique phenomenon to Rwanda. I saw it in Mombasa, I saw it in Dar es Salaam, I saw it in Zanzibar, and I have also interacted with some of the Senegalese Rasta who are in the borderline of the Bai Fall, the followers of Ibra Fall and Amadou Bamba. So you get also the dreadlock Muslims of West Africa and the dreadlock Muslim Rasta of West Africa. So I found that there are certain parts of Africa that also have that particular phenomena. Give thanks.
Yes, give thanks, General Thau Thau, for the explanation. Jahpila, we'd like to hear your comment on some of the questions and comments that have come from the audience. We'd like to say that our time is quite stretched, and so if we can keep it brief and bring the meeting to a conclusion, that would be favorable. So, Jahpila, please, your comment on some of the questions and comments that have come up. Give thanks. Yeah, Jahpila, are you available to speak? Ruben Kush, I still see your hand. Yeah, so we are wrapping up to end the meeting.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
very brief.
Can I?
Yes.
I just want to share with the Rasta and the Quran. In 2010, I was fortunate to go on a delegation with the AU to Libya. This was before Gaddafi was still alive at that time. And while I was there, I tried to observe how the black man was living in Libya. And I found that the black man was musicians, they drove the dust carts, they didn't really own any shops. They were just there as the minority to the Arabs. And one of the days I went to the old part of Libya, and while I was walking around, I came across one black man, a Rasta, and he owned a shop, the only black shop that I saw in Libya. And in this shop, it was selling African artifacts, Muslim artifacts as well, Muslim books, African books. And I found it really strange to see a Rasta in Libya, where Libya was a Muslim country. It was governed by what they call the Green Book, and everyone in Libya was seen as a Muslim. So to find this one Rasta in Libya, in a predominantly Muslim country with a shop, I could see that he had he was influenced by the Quran, especially with the Green Book that governed the country of Libya. So I just wanted to share that because when Ras Thau Thau mentioned that influence that he saw with a brethren with the Quran, it just brought that to my mind. So, I mean, the influence of His Majesty stretches throughout all religions. There's always ones who get to be influenced by His Majesty to actually stand out from the rest and make a living through his shop. So I just wanted to share that. So give thanks. Bless.
Yes, give thanks, Ruben Kush. Yeah, so we are rounding up to the end of the session. Jahpila, we still haven't heard your responses to some of the questions and comments. If you don't have any, we recognize the presence of some RCC members. There's Mike Palm and Press Dr. Aini. Yes, and a host of others. We'd like to invite Daddy B to give us a comment before the panel give us their closing remarks. So, Daddy B, please. Yeah, Daddy Bosco. So please, if Daddy B is not available, we'll invite closing comments from our panel. So first, we'll start from Dr. Sadia. Are you here? Yes, I think Empress Sadia left us. We'll go to Dr. Oppong-Wadie for his closing remarks. Give thanks.
Give thanks, Ras Kofi Asante. I think that I give thanks for this event. It's been a great event. The reasonings have been solid. And, unity is the accepted goal. More often than not, when we think about unity, we tend to think of it in terms of we all believing in the same things and we all acting in the same ways. But that is an impossible goal to speak. Unity means that we are able to come together and work towards specific goals. So it is my fervent hope that this reasoning has provided an opportunity for us to be able to think about goals that we can all work towards, to uplift the image and liberty of Rastafari. Give thanks to all the commenters, give thanks to the panelists, and give thanks to the organizers. Rastafari.
Selassie. Yes, we give thanks. Indeed, unity is the accepted goal. General Thau Thau, please, your closing remarks.
Give thanks, Ras Kofi Asante and the Rastafari Council Ghana and the esteemed panelists who shared a lot of knowledge, a lot of information. Recognize that this type of discourse, they are our own educational where we continue to learn. His Majesty said, there is no end to learning. We learn until to the grave. So I would like to just encourage you to continue with these programs so that we can edify each other. We can strengthen one another, as the Rastafari philosophy say, iron sharpen iron. So we are able to share our foresight and our insight, our spiritual foresight and insight as far as Rastafari is concerned. Give thanks for the moment. Give thanks for everyone who's here. Enough respect to the elders and the matriarchs who are in the platform, Mama Aini, Queen Mother Moses, and all those who are present here. Rastafari, give thanks.
We give thanks. Yes, this reasoning was powered by the Media and Publicity Commission of RCG to celebrate the birth of His Majesty. And indeed, yes, the king is born. The life and impact of Emperor Haile Selassie has been well discussed. Most of us have learnt a lot. I've taken a lot of notes that will, as food for thought, that we'll be digesting for a long time. We want to thank the panel, General Thau Thau, Dr. Oppong-Wadie, Empress Sadia, Jahpila, and even Ras Lyrics who couldn't make it. We thank you all, the delegates to RCC reps who joined us, and every Rasta man and woman anywhere who joined us for this reasoning. We'll continue the reasoning come next 2 weeks. We appreciate your presence. So Rastafari, yes, indeed, the king is born. It's such a joyful moment for I and I. Rastafari. We hereby bring the meeting to a close. Give thanks.
Guidance and protection, family. Aye, aye. Blessed love.
Blessed